Okay, well, hello, we're here. It's the Tony McClelland Show, Critical Reflections with your critical friends. And I've not been here for a little while, but what better time to come back than to discuss this pressing subject, which I know that I've had lots of messages about this, the riots in the UK, what's caused it, how we're going to deal with it, and the aftermath. And just for context, there was, for my international friends that may or may not be listening right now, or maybe you're going to come in on the replay, we had an incident in the UK where 3 little innocent girls were murdered in Stockport, the UK, and there were rumours that it was somebody of a Muslim background who was asylum seeker or refugee. And even though those rumours were unfounded, many people were injured in the process. What followed was lots of protests, marches and riots across the UK. And I have a very selected carefully selected panel of 2 guests that I'm going to be discussing this very subject with, and hopefully we're going to be able to share some tips that you as leaders are going to be able to use to help you. So without further ado, I'm Tony McClelland. I'm a critical friend and a business mentor and a queen of compassion. So I work with lots of leaders around these particular subjects in third sector and social causes. And we have the wonderful G. Welcome, G. How are you?
Hi, how are you doing, Tony?
I'm fine, thank you. So G is an ex-police officer, BAFTA-winning keynote speaker, and doing lots of work with organisations in relation to identity. Is that right, G?
Identity and all things inclusion.
All things inclusion, absolutely. And we have my wonderful colleague, Gary Turner, who is... He talks a lot about value in vulnerability, done a big podcast on that. Change is an inside job is another one of Gary's strap lines or narrative, and he's done lots of global work in supply chain. So welcome. So welcome, Gary and G. Lovely to have you here. I'm not sure if we're live on LinkedIn, but when we get into the thrust of things, I shall check on that shortly. However, I wanted to check in to just see, in the context of everything that's happened, the riots, given the context, what happened, with the 3 little girls, and let's just take a moment, first of all, to just hold some space for just a few seconds, just to remember those people that were injured there. Okay, so just remembering those and all those that were affected by things that happened afterwards in those riots across the UK. Many cities were affected. So I just wanted to check in, first of all, G and Gary. How are you feeling? How does it make you feel? I know just talking about this subject, it's quite, it can be quite triggering. So how does it all make you feel? First of all, let's hear from you, G, and then we'll move on to that.
I think I've got mixed feelings around it, really. I mean, obviously there's the heaviness, there's the sadness, but there's also the fact that, they say social media played a lot in the riots, but it also can be very much part of the solution as well. And I'm hopeful that we can use social media to kind of help people to heal from this and find ways forward. So I'm in that place of a kind of sad optimism, if that's kind of great. Yeah,
because I must admit, when we've seen these types of things before, we haven't had the impact of social media as well in the mix. So it's almost as if like a fire spreading very quickly and fiercely, rather than just burning slowly. So thank you. Anything else you want to add on that before we move on to Gary?
No, I mean, that's where I am at the moment. That's why I'm happy to be here. It's just to help us to process some of that stuff, which is what you said. So I'm looking forward to the hour.
Good.
Go to Gary now. Yeah.
And thank you so much for being here as well, G. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Tony.
Gary, let's hear from you.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Thanks, G. I think for me, I love what G just said, to be honest, but for me, there's this, I feel like we're in a liminal space between like the old world. Yeah, this stuff's happened before, right? It's not new. So it's almost like it's been raised to the surface in a more violent way because of social media. Like everybody's felt it rather than just certain subsets of the community. And I think there is an opportunity, as painful as it is, and it's horrible to think about the loss of those girls, but in their name, in some way, I can really feel a possibility for us to heal a community, as G said, bring people together more. And we have to remember technology isn't good or bad. It's agnostic. It's how you use it. And I think we forget sometimes. We're led to believe that the tool is an end in itself. And I think if we can remember it's a tool, we can use it for good as well. That's what I'm sitting in at the moment.
Absolutely. So it is a tricky one because there's so much, but really what we're going to do for this hour is just really focusing on some fundamental things, but really towards the end, we'll look at the practicalities of things that people can do, leaders can do. And so let's just start off really. Protests, marches, riots, it's all kind of feeling as if it's moving towards the same thing. It's all rolling into one when they're actually very, very separate things. Marches, which, you have your right to marches, but people are kind of turning it very quickly into riots. Why do you think that is? G or Gary? I'm just leaving that open.
I mean, I think we've got to look at it's not just what happened, but the build up to it.
Absolutely.
Politicians, especially when they get to a place where they're desperate for whatever reason, and it's a well-known playbook. They will always go back to immigration. It's something that they can guarantee that they will get emotional buy-in. And if you looked at some of the language that was coming up in the past year, language like we're being swamped, they're flooding the country, and all this sort of stuff. I mean, this was language that I heard when my parents heard when they came over in the 50s and the 60s. So it's not new language, but it's a new generation hearing it. And I think that over the past year or two, that's been slowly built and built and built and built and built. The other side of that coin, I think, is a lot of organizations have cut down on their EDI training and minimized it. And I think what they did, they created a vacuum. And your far right and your disaffected people stepped into that vacuum and capitalized on it. And I think that's where we are. We took our eyes off the ball for a while, and we thought, yes, everything's nice now. We're now going in the right direction, and I think it just shows how fragile this can be.
Absolutely. Thank you, G. I won't add my thoughts at the moment. I'll just come straight on to Gary, but thank you so much for that contribution.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. So I'm going to come at a slightly different angle, which is from the corporate space, right? As you know, I work in a multi-billion turnover company, and I find it really interesting, the discomfort, and I can understand it, but it's not enough, the discomfort of senior leadership to ignore or erase that any of this has happened at all. So we've got to hit the numbers, we've got to keep moving forward, we've got targets to hit, the shareholders say X, Y, Z. And there's this really interesting observation that I've seen in the last sort of 4 weeks, which is a real sort of, I talk about leadership, Tony and G, being that you see true leaders. They're like diamonds, right? They're formed under pressure. or the ones that aren't true leaders or shouldn't be in that capacity, tend to evaporate into dust in moments like this. So I'm just really curious to observe in different, particularly in business spaces, who are prepared to get uncomfortable and try and lean into this difficult conversation, and who are the ones that stay away from it. So that's an interesting thing I'm observing at the moment.
Ask a question around that. Sorry. Yeah, because what you just said there, for me, it sparked that same sort of phenomenon. I'm going to call it a phenomenon, for want of a better word, around when George Floyd happened. You know, you had that same sort of, who are the real leaders here? Who are the people who are doing this or taking this on board? But you also had those people that came up and sort of like, they didn't really seize the moment, but they capitalized on it. If that makes sense.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, if I may just quickly, one of Tony's things that she advocates so brilliantly, right, is community. And I think what I'd like to finish my point on at this stage in response, G, is that there's a lot of leaders that are the ones that actually influence. They don't have the power. And I think it's high time we started actually looking around our organizations and in our communities going, oh, they're the real leader. Let's now give them the power as well, because they can drive the change that we need in our communities.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that you say that, Gary, because it's one of the things that I think about, that, you know, leaders are not the ones that have the titles only. You know, there are lots of leaders that don't have big titles, you know, and there was an example a very long time ago when I was in my youth work days and managing community centres and youth work. And I remember, you know, when I was managing this community area, there was a couple of youth centres and you know, I was given this induction: go and meet the head teacher of the school where the youth centre is in, go and meet the head of the resident association, go and meet the counsellor, and all these people with titles. And I went and met them, but the person that decided whether that youth club was successful or not was the caretaker.
Boom.
And I needed to get him on board because I wanted a successful youth club. Yeah. So that for me was a real telltale thing that, you know, we need to look beyond those titles for those leaders, because they are there and they're the ones that have the influence. And quite often when I go into organizations, you know, I'm looking for the movers and shakers, because sometimes they're not sitting in the big chairs. Sometimes they're not the ones that are paying the invoices. They're the ones that are probably sitting in the back of the staff room holding court. They're the ones that I want to be amongst and hear what's going on. So I think that whole point of what you're saying there is really, we need to dig deep and look within the community or look within the workforce, within the organizations, to say, who are the people of influence? Who are the natural leaders coming through? Because some of those other leaders are, you know, not necessarily going the right way or sharing the right word. You know, some of them are well intended. They have really good intentions, but actually they don't seek advice at that point. They don't seek support at that point. Go out. Let me go out there with this good intention, and it all goes wrong, you know, because that impact assessment hasn't taken place. And I think that's the bit that I'm always looking at, that if you dig a bit deeper, the answers are there. The answers are always in the community. So that's kind of one of the things I would say.
Can I add to that? Because I love that. I love what you just said there. Well, I've got a bit of an echo coming through. I don't know why. I love what you just said there, because I did some work when I was in the police for an estate. We were trying to figure out how we could empower people on the estate to say no more crime on this area, so to speak. And one of the things, like you said, people said, oh, you need to speak to this person. They're the head of this and they're the chair of this. And I think there are leaders in communities that don't even know that they're leaders.
That's right.
They don't even know that they're leaders. And two examples hit me. One was, there was a guy who ran a newsagent on the estate. And he had been there something like about 40 odd years. And he had seen all the kids grow up, become adults, and have their own kids. He knew everything about everybody, but nobody ever went to him to talk to him about anything. Yeah. because he wasn't on this committee or he wasn't part of this group or stuff like that. But he knew everything about that estate. Everything. Because he'd been there so long. And then the other one for me was I was working for another organization, and this was back in the days when I was a smoker. And they had a restaurant on site, and I was standing outside, and I'll mention this guy's name, Chris. Chris was a dishwasher in this place, and we were talking, and Chris just says to me, he says, I could save this organization a fortune in the restaurant. And I said, how? He goes, I know what people don't eat.
Okay.
Because I have to throw it away.
Ah, okay.
And I thought, nobody's ever actually sat down. What if the chef sat down with him and said, okay, what's working and what's not working? Here is a guy that probably pays minimum wage. People just see him as a dishwasher, but actually he's got the key to helping you save a lot of money. And I think in this space, that's the leaders that we need to identify.
Absolutely. And just to kind of bring in, again, Gary, I will give you a chance to contribute at this piece, but it reminds me when I was, a principal of a school, and, we used to have these meetings at these briefings and debriefings at the beginning and the end of the day. And I remember clearly having a debrief at the end of the day, and all the people were contributing, but actually the people that could really contribute the best were the ones that were in the office, the receptionist that was in the office, that gets into school at 8 o'clock and sees everybody, or sees little Johnny that's coming to school scraggedy, that may not, somebody that's being dropped off really early and going around or looking through the bins. They're the ones that had the vital pieces of information that we needed, yet they were always missing from the meetings. They're the ones. And so really we need to look at, I think this whole thing about titles and power is it's just kind of can be a little bit misrepresented. Gary, I'm going to ask you to come in, but one of the things I'm going to do is just welcome anyone that's joined us now on LinkedIn Live. We did have a technical difficulty with our LinkedIn Live, but hopefully you've joined us now. We've got that going, and LinkedIn is a little bit slow today, but it's just managed to kick in. And if you've just joined us, we've got wonderful G and Gary Turner, and we're talking about the UK riots and what's happened with the UK riots and what leaders need to do to equip themselves to be able to support their communities, whatever that community looks like. So on that basis, do feel free, let us know that you're here. If you have any questions for this wonderful panel, then do, put some questions in, and we will go from there. So over to you, Gary, on that point.
Well, I'm not going to add too much more at this juncture, Tony, on that particular point. What I'd like to invite, though, is something around the topic of vulnerability. You mentioned earlier I had a podcast for a long time. It's really easy when we think about vulnerability, right, to go, I've got to open up my heart and run in and you just stab me a million times and then I've been vulnerable with my team. Whereas what I keep trying to get leaders to understand is showing just a bit more of your true self in that moment, whether it is talking about your kids, saying you don't know, as you said earlier, asking for help, these really basic human, I am fallible. That to me is the definition of vulnerability. It's relational, right? It's not about going wide open, stab me to death. And I think we've got a pandemic. I don't want to use that word again, but I think within workplaces in particular, we've got a pandemic of silence. Leaders that are totally invulnerable, and they believe. So I was in literally a meeting last Friday, Tony and G, having a conversation with an executive leader about this. They've got so many channels. They've got engagement surveys. They've got feedback. They've got Ask Me Anything. They've got anonymous XYZ. Yet nobody's using them. And I said to them, why do you think that is? Do you feel people feel safe to use those channels? Yeah, of course. We've got 7 of them. Yeah. But I said, you just said that people aren't using them, though. So you've got them. They're not being used. And you could see in his face, just couldn't reconcile because his mask was up. He had to have all the answers. If he had a little bit of vulnerability, he could have said, Gary, I'm going to investigate that. I just didn't see that. And what if there's something in that? I'm going to check on it. But he just could not bring himself to go, I do not know, or I can't be completely sure that's not fact. So he shut it down.
Absolutely.
It's just fascinating.
And sometimes if they do use these systems that are in place and they're not listened to, then we get the protests and the marches and the stamping of the feet.
Beautiful link.
Okay? So
Beautiful
let's make
link.
sure that we're putting this out, but not in a performative way as well. It has to be quite genuine, because one of the things that I, especially when we're talking about consultation, I'm going to come to you in a moment, G, but really just, I've seen so many leaders and they do this evaluation piece or, staff satisfaction surveys, and 60%, we had 60% of people that responded and they said this and this and this, so we're going to do this and this and this. What about the other 40%? What are we doing with those? They're the important ones as well. Let's do some more work about why they're not, they just didn't engage, it's up to them. Well, let's find out why. And explore that a little bit more, because that to me is where the real work is. Yeah. Gee, I'm just going to kind of come to you now. So.
Can I go back to this leadership thing for a little while? Because one of the things I was sitting there thinking is, we talk about leaders in organizations and stuff like that, but when you looked at the riots, they had, the people who were rioting had their own leaders too.
That's right.
Right. And I think it's something that Gary said at the beginning, of social media is a tool, right? It's how we use it, and it can be used for good or it can be used for bad. Leadership is the same. Leadership is the same. People talk about leaders and you say Hitler was a leader. Right? Mandela was a leader. Right? Some of these dictators around the world are leaders. And I think we need to be clear about what type of leadership we want.
Well, this is it. And I'm glad that you've brought that up, because all of the people that you've named, G, are good leaders.
Yeah.
However, the content or what they're leading might not necessarily be agreeable to many. And so I'm going to be controversial just for a moment. Nothing new, I'll just put something out there. I once said to somebody, I wanted to wake some people up. So I once said to them, well, something, gang leaders make really good leaders. And they said to me, what are you saying, Tony? Are you saying that gang leaders should rule the world? Well, actually, no. But if you look at what happened over the pandemic, they were the first to get themselves together. If they were in the drugs market, they were turning into, Uber drivers while everybody else was wondering what was going on. If you're not a good gang leader, you end up dead, basically. This is it. So I then followed that up and said, well, actually, what we've got is very good leaders leading on the wrong things. And instead, we've got bad leaders leading on the right things. Did you like the way I've done my little swivel?
I did. Oh, I love that. Class.
So I know, and this is where the thing about, I'm not going to get into it too much, about behavior comes into it. Because if we take the behavior traits of a gang leader per se and apply some good leadership knowledge and information, etc., we're more likely to get the result that we want. So that I'm going to leave that there, just going to throw it out there and leave that there just for a moment. But we have got Dr. Comfort, who is saying that she agrees how we use leadership is key. Absolutely. Absolutely. And there's leaders with titles and there's leaders without the big titles. We've talked about that.
And there's leaders who are actually managers and not leaders.
Well, that's a whole bit again. You two are terrible because you're just throwing these things out there and everyone's got to catch them. So Tom, I know that you're there. Come and contribute to this as well. So if you do want to see what we were talking about beforehand for the last 15 minutes, then do jump over to the YouTube channel where the the full version will be there, but we will be coming back as well, and I'll tell you more about that later on. But over to G and Gary before we move into the next piece. Any concluding thoughts on that piece around good and bad leadership?
I think for me, the conclusion is we just need to be aware of what is it we want from our leaders before we even decide who the leaders are. What are we looking for?
Absolutely. Well, I know that this particular segment is around good people leadership. And I'm really a great advocate of business leadership, because ultimately we can have good leaders, people leaders, and we can have people that are good at skills. But if you're not good at business acumen, where are we leading the people up the garden path? And quite often you will see people being promoted through an organization. They come through over years and are promoted into these leadership roles, very good at the people part of it, but not necessarily good at piecing it together with the business part of it, to make it work and to make the business grow and the two pieces coming together. And there's nothing to say that groups cannot work together. People leaders, business leaders, how they work together. So that's kind of, But Charles has got a contribution there to make. Not sure I agree. Some of these people are more like very good manipulators rather than leaders. Interesting. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit, Charles? Thank you.
It's an interesting one, Charles. I love it. It's a fine line between influencing and manipulation, right?
Well, I mean, absolutely. But it makes me think of a time where I was working with young offenders, face to face, and you can spend so long trying to get them to do something, but actually it's so much easier to, okay, I want you to walk to the end of the road. Well, no, why do I need to do that? All of this. Come on, let's walk and talk. And before you know it, we're there. Is that manipulation or is that leading the way? Not sure. Need to think about that. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, and I think we need to think about in the context of the riots as well. We're tending to go into the corporate space, but in the context of the riots, who are some of the manipulators are the people that we think are the leaders.
Absolutely, and that goes back to the business knowledge or the intention. And really, they're not necessarily good at business. They're quite good at influencing. And so we'll take that. I've seen lots of people just kind of trying to rally others and come on, we need to do this. But what they're influencing might not necessarily be that great. So, yeah. Okay, so let's just kind of move the conversation on a little bit and just kind of coming back to the riots specifically. What I've also seen, not only, we touched on the marches, protests and riots, all kind of getting bundled in together when they're all separate things. But this whole piece around, some people are kind of bundling it into a race thing, when actually it started off with in terms of religion and culture initially. Yeah, but it's turned into something that is race. How do you feel about that? How do you see that? And for me, it's that whole piece around when we talk about DEIB, some people just automatically think that it's just about race. It's not just about race. It's about so many different things. It's about diversity and that inclusion piece. You're smiling, G. Gary?
Yeah, I remember working with a HR manager, and I won't mention it, for an organization, and we were talking about diversity. And she stops me halfway through and she says, G, it's not just about diversity. It's also about women. It's also about gay people. And I stopped and I looked at her and I said, oh, so for you, diversity is purely about race.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's the thing. We've kind of created this code word, this polite way of saying race, but we don't say race. We say EDI or stuff like that. And I say to organizations, if you're going to use these words, you have to be very clear about what you're saying. You can't use it as a code.
That's right.
You have to be clear. If you're talking about race, you talk about race. And I think the fact that it always keeps coming back to race is that we've never really addressed race properly.
No, that's right.
We've never really sat down and said we need to do some serious work around
also, it. And also, on the back of that, because the riots were initially around culture, really, wasn't it? And religion. It was about religion, but because people are not understanding religion, it turns into the race. And this is where cultural intelligence and competence comes in as well. And these are some of the things that we need to equip ourselves with, that knowledge. And if we don't have that knowledge, reach out to people that can share that knowledge with us. Gary?
No, to be honest with you, I'm still fascinated and troubled in equal manner by the speed with which that unfolded, if I'm honest. And again, we spoke about social media, but I do also think there is something here around cultural intelligence, Tony, 100%, because I myself, as a Caucasian man, like, I didn't honestly think about these things in a major way until probably 6 or 7 years ago, because I didn't need to, and I wasn't curious, and I wasn't vulnerable enough to look beyond my own privilege. And I thought the world looked like this for everybody, right? And that's a very genuine, because I've been conditioned that way. And when we start to work on that conditioning, and I'm going to use a word that you pointed to earlier, curiosity. I think these riots would not have happened if people went from a place of curiosity instead of a place of fear. And I think this is the single biggest thing for me, is everything is predicated, right? If you look at the political system at the moment, you look at the narratives that come out, even social media, everything's about fear, right? If you don't have it, you're worthless. If they don't like you, you're a nobody. Like, so without saying it, every part of our modern day Western systems are telling us we're not worthy. When what we need to invite people to remember is that before all of that, they're already a 10 out of 10. They're already a 10 out of 10 self-worth till they leave their bedroom. But we had it all conditioned out of us. And I think that, so that's a big part of this for me, is remembering our self-worth.
And our dignity.
Dignity is a nice add as well. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And also, you know, I just want to kind of bring in the fact that the whole piece around the riot, it doesn't just affect people of a particular culture or religion. It doesn't only affect people of color, Black people. It affects people not of color too, white people. And I want to have those conversations with not only people of color, Black people, but with white people too. You know, Gary, I want to be able to include people like yourself in those conversations. I want to hear what is your experience from your side, as well as what it is, you know, that I'm feeling, and from other perspectives as well. So for me, I think that when we're talking about culture, religion, it's that whole diverse piece. Let's include other people too. Yeah. Not just it's affected us, so it's about us, nothing to do with you. This is how it affects us. How's it affecting you? I bring them into that conversation. That's how I want to kind of embrace that. I don't know.
If I may add, I'd love to your thoughts on this, G. But I just thought there's a brilliant example of what you're speaking about, Tony, with the imam up in the northwest, straight after the murder. Instead of walking away from the very people that they were told they should be afraid of on social media, he walked towards them. Brave, massively brave, but that was just, that to me, that is leadership. That is leadership.
Yeah.
That's the absolute personification of it.
Yeah.
Well, the other example is that when there were some protests before, there was another Black man that, you know, saw a white man injured and carried him over his shoulder.
Yes.
That was so.
Good friend of mine.
Oh, really?
So that is another great example of stepping into it, and that's why we want to have these conversations here. So that's let's just kind of look at some other aspects of this. So I think it's important to remember what G was saying about the build-up beforehand and all of that, and let's not ignore that. But you've got to feel that build-up beforehand to understand how we've got to that point and how we can prevent it. Once you feel that build-up, you can generally feel something going. But I want to touch upon How much of this is about wealth, power, ego, and control? I know, Gary, you've got some thoughts on that. Let's just touch on that for a moment before we move into some other areas.
How long have you got?
No, I can tell you, it's not how long I've got; it's how long you've got. You got probably a couple of minutes to share your million thoughts.
No, joking about this is a real passion thing for me, because again, I'm joining corporate space with, you know, regular Joe, John, and Bill trying to go about their lives, right? You cannot ignore, and anybody that's watching us live, thank you for joining us. Go and do the research for yourself. I'm going to invite you to look at 3 graphs. One is the number of billionaires over the last 5 years. A second graph is the terrible exponential spike in food bank usage in the UK over the last 14 years. And have a look at the FTSE 100 stock market. When you put these 3 things next to each other, it just shows you why so much of this catalyst, I believe, of the riots, yes, a lot of it was very untoward, but a lot of people got wrapped up in it because of a lack of investment. So much more wealth is being extracted from what even used to be the middle class. I'm not a classist person, but there's less and less money basically in the pocket of the worker, and more being extracted into the super rich. And every measure you can find yourself online tells you the same thing. So that's why I look at this systemically. So yeah, you know, behaviors are massive, but we've also got to look at who's pulling the strings. And those 2 things together, who's ultimately pulling the strings and what behaviors need to change. Through those 2 concurrent lenses, I think we can do a lot of good and help to avoid repeats of these of the fuel, really, the tinderbox that was this riot. But we can't get away from the lack of investment in our communities.
Okay, I've got some thoughts, but I'll let G share his. Because
No, go with your thoughts, because you've given me stuff to ponder there for a while. I need to ponder what you've just said there, Gary. So, Tony, give me a second and say what you need to say, and I'll come back in afterwards.
Okay, well, I'm gonna.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna actually deflect on that and bring some people in that are kind of making some contributions. And this is an interesting one. Charles is saying fear or anger, or does the fear lead to anger? Interesting. Perhaps it does.
You see, now this is interesting because, you know, you said that when we talk about the build-up, we could see this coming. Right, the work has been done. If you look at the work of oh god, what's his name? Gordon Allport. Right, he did this thing called the scale of prejudice, and how it rises, and all the ingredients to kick off this scale of prejudice or this ladder of prejudice are there. And anybody who looks at this, it says you need some kind of destability in society, would that be financial, social, whatever it is. You need something that upsets society. Yeah? You need some fear within that, right? And then all you need then is for somebody to start in rumors around why you're afraid, why you have no money in your pockets, right? Why you have no job, right? And that's the kickoff. And it starts with, they call that level antilocution. You then need, now we've identified who the problem is, right? We start avoiding them.
Interesting.
Right? Then we go from
certainly lots to consider, certainly lots to think about, you know. Definitely.
And you go from avoidance to physical to you need somebody in power to validate those fears. Which is where your politicians come in now and say, immigration is the problem. So we've identified that it's about immigrants, right? And what do those immigrants look like? Then you get physical attack, right? And then you get to the top level, which is get out. We don't want you here.
Well, actually, and how much of it is down to the media narrative as well?
And that's all feeds into it.
The media narrative that's leading it, because, you know, what can I say on that? But I just want to kind of share a little bit of what Stephen has. I won't bring it up because it's quite a lot of a comment, but what Stephen Gray is saying, that maybe the police, if they had been able to release more details of the children stabbing guy, I think it would have cooled things. You know, so maybe if they were a bit more upfront around the information that they were putting out. What are your thoughts, What are your thoughts around that and media?
You're just throwing it to both of us, or
Go on, G. After you, G. After you, G.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. I like what you did there.
Yeah, let's have you, G, because it's your turn to speak now.
I mean, I think when those three young girls were murdered, tragically murdered, I don't think anybody expected the reaction that we were going to get. Right. So I think decisions were made at the time based on how things were at the time. But what happened was, I mean, is that people just took that, and you can't control who goes on social media and starts a rumor. That is an unknown. That is not a variable you can't control. And that's what happened with those three girls. Somebody went on and just put out a rumor, and it just spread like wildfire. And Absolutely. That's not something that, you know, no matter what information you put out, and you have to balance what information you're going to put out. You can't put out everything because it's a live investigation.
Absolutely. But there was something that felt very different about this particular one. Maybe
yeah, I think it's one of those things that just struck at the right, you know, it was a catalyst. It was a match that was looking for a box to strike. And that just happened to be it.
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
If it wasn't, that would have been something else. But it was looking, yeah.
Okay, so just to move things along a little bit, I just want to ask around, you know, because this is really pertinent for leaders as well, to really be thinking about where do our own views come from? You know, do we challenge our views? And I, you know, I have a quote, and that quote is that I don't wait for others to challenge my views because I'm too busy challenging my own. And that's the thing about it. Where do they come from? Were they, you know, inflicted upon us from other people that we're around? Are they things that because we're in a particular environment, or do we actually own them ourselves? You know, so this is the thing, and we've got to sit down and think, well, why do I feel that way about this particular individual or this particular situation? I know I'm always questioning myself and trying to understand my emotions and feelings. So there's that piece. Have you got anything that you want to kind of contribute in relation to challenging your own thoughts, challenging your own thinking, challenging your own beliefs, where they come from, and understanding that?
I'll let Gary start first this time.
Yeah. Thanks for the hot potato, G. Just
well, I never had it that the two of you would be shy now.
We're just playing. We're just playing. We're just playing.
I know.
I think, you know, as you say, I've got one of my key mantras, Tony, is change is an inside job. And I say that very sincerely and deliberately, because I do believe change comes from within inside of each of us. It becomes inside of organizations. You know, there's a lot of things outside that can influence change, but change comes from within, whether it's an organization, a community, ourselves. I really do believe that. And what I observe, and I can imagine a lot of the people that got wrapped up, I'm not going to speak for those for the riots that actually wanted to cause harm and divide us. That's one completely different entity. But we know there was a lot of people that are now in prison that went out that morning with no intention of being part of a race riot and ending up in prison, right? There's no way everybody felt that way. So where I'm going with that is we're still quiet, and particularly men, and I'm saying that as someone myself that's had to do a lot of inner work, we are still conditioned to be invulnerable, to be stoic, to have all the, we're going back around again, but it's important. We are so conditioned to live below the neck. It's that feeling in our body of, you know, oh my God, that doesn't feel right. We stuff that down. We've been told to stuff that down. Don't trust your gut. Don't trust your intuition. Got to be logical. Got to make sense. That's the thing to do. And I think if you look at a lot of the people with power in any range of systems, whether it be political, business, other, it's still an awful lot of men. And it's an awful lot of men that look and sound like me. And I'm not judging any of those people for being in those positions, but I am challenging, why do we not have more diverse representation in every strata of society in 2024? And how might that be informed by the fact there's still a massive underdevelopment of this head-heart, head-gut connection that I think's been cut off for far too long. So there are a few things that I'm bubbling around at the moment.
Thank you for that wonderful speech, Gary.
Sorry, sermon over.
No, it was absolutely valuable. Now, G, come and follow that. Come with your contribution.
Just in terms of how,
Just in terms of how people are thinking, and for them to challenge their own thinking.
I think there's a step before challenging your own inner thoughts, and that's knowing that you can.
Okay.
And finding a way to understand that you can. I mean, I tell a story in my group sometimes, and this is a true story. It happened to me. I was doing some work in Scotland, and I was coming back, and I'm on a plane at Edinburgh Airport, and this voice comes over the tannoy. So we'll be taking off in about 5 minutes. The weather's clear. We might even be land ahead of time. Blah 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 blah. This is your captain, Mary Jane Smith. Right? So it was a woman captain. Right? I'm a diversity trainer. I do all this work for a living. And I'm sitting on this chair in this plane, and suddenly my whole body stiffened up. And this fear came over me. Oh my God, this woman driver. And then I stopped and I thought, where the hell did that come from? I would say I've done the work. But then I look at it and I said, it's not about challenging, it's about knowing that you can challenge yourself. Knowing that you can question these thoughts and ideas you have, and not just accept them, that this is just part of who I am. And that's why I said, when it comes, it's not the challenge, it's knowing that you can. Having Absolutely. The awareness that you can. And I think part of that is we need to help people to understand what awareness means, because you're never going to get rid of it. But what you can do is start to teach people how to recognize it within themselves and how to question themselves.
Absolutely. And I think that, it's really key. And just understanding and knowing that those self-talks are really valuable.
Yeah.
And it's okay. They can actually happen.
And you can tell that voice to shut up. Yeah.
And you can actually stand in front of the mirror if it helps, and just, challenge yourself and talk to yourself and know that it's okay. And if you need somebody in front of you, because quite often when I'm working with leaders and people, they may say something and say, well, what do you think, Tony? And I say, well, what do you think? This is your self-talk. I'm just privy to be witness to it. What do you think? Does that sound good to you? How does that sound to you? Well, there you go. You know the answer. I'm just here to witness that it actually took place. And throw it back on them, because ultimately they know deep down. It goes back to what Gary said about that instinct, that feeling. You feel it rising, and you know that you can't ignore it, and we've got to be so in tune with those things. So thank you so much, G. I can see Gary's twitching. He wants to come in and say something. Go for it, Gary.
Just a quick thing. Tony, honestly, absolutely stunning. Really, really stunning feedback. And you've got me thinking about that piece around knowing that we can, that permission piece. Yeah. And I think the only person that can actually give any of us permission is ourselves. And I think this is the thing we need to remember and it's a remembering. So that consciousness piece, that awareness piece, G, thank you for reminding me of that in this moment, because it's easy when we've done a lot of that work and continue to do that work to forget that was a really critical part of the journey, is to go, I can look in the mirror for 10 seconds. This is a genuine tip for anyone watching or watching back. Try and stand and look at yourself deep in the eyes in the mirror, and don't look away for 10 seconds, and check how you feel head, heart, gut. If you're not used to it, you're going to feel horrific. And that's a brilliant exercise you can just practice to get used to just looking at yourself. You don't have to think anything. Just look in the mirror and don't look away. Because that's something that was just a really, so thank you both. You've just reminded me of the importance of that, giving ourselves permission.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And it's important that we actually do that, and we think about that growth. So I'm going to just mention my blend model, because I think it's really important. It kind of pulls some of these components together that we're talking about. The blend is, the B is behavior, innate, taught, learned, habitual behavior. Recognize it, understand it. I don't think that we pay enough attention to behavior, what type of behavior it is, how we're going to unpick it. And quite often people have this perception that I'm going to tell you to change, G, and you're just going to change. That's how they think it works. But anyway, I know that you're both going to have something to say about that. The L is learning. How do we take on board learning? Kinesthetic, audio, visual, lots of different types of ways of learning and engaging in that learning to change behavior. The E is environment. How do our environmental factors have an impact on how we learn the environment around us, the building, the room, you know, that building? How does that impact our learning and our behavior? So the N is for network. Who's around us that's influencing us, that we didn't think that we were listening, but actually we are listening and we're following, even though we don't want to admit it, that we are. Yeah. And some of you may have heard me say that my husband always talks about network. If you hang around a barber's, you will end up getting your hair cut. All right. So, and that's a fact. And no matter, some people say, I've got no hair, but you'll end up going in for a shave or something. Something. All right. And then the D is for development and our own self-awareness, which you know you both touched on earlier on. And so I use that combination to really think about what are those components of change, and that's what works for me. So I don't know if any of you want to say anything on that before we kind of move towards kind of giving some real tips to these leaders. Is there anything you want to kind of contribute to? Behavior, learning, environment, network, own development, self-awareness, anything particular you want to share?
I mean, you know, I'm as you said, I made a film, or I was the subject of a film called The Black Cop, which is available on YouTube. And in that, I talk about all of those things you just mentioned there, Tony. I talk about how they impacted on me. You know, for the first 8 years, very shortly, for the first 8 years of my life, I grew up in a little white village in Kent, and I was the only black kid in this village. I was fostered, and I grew up in a white world. Right? But there's a B I think you've missed out, which I don't know whether you can weave it in somewhere, but it's also belonging. Right? And I grew up in this village, and as much as everybody liked me, there was always this thing that said, I don't belong. Right? I then moved from an all-white place to London, to Harlesden, to stay with my natural birth parents. And I was in a predominantly black space, where, again, I didn't feel like I belonged.
Yeah, interesting.
Right? And how that plays on your mind. And you're trying to, where do I fit into this? And then I moved from there, and I was taken to Nigeria.
Okay.
And then as a kid, I'm in Nigeria thinking, I don't belong here. Right? And all this stuff, you know, you're never fully in, you don't have that foundation of growth because you're always unbalanced. And I think that's when you look at what's been happening with what caused the riots. There are a lot of people who don't feel like they belong. Right? There's a lot of people who feel unbalanced. Right? They're not sure of their identity. They're not sure of their place in society. And it's all thrown up all these questions that they haven't got the skills to answer. So they're looking for someone to tell them the answers.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that in at such a poignant time, G, because as we kind of move towards a wrap up, it really, anyone that's been listening here now, you know, I need to tell you that we're going to be doing a part 2 with a couple of other colleagues as well. And we're going to be talking about those safe spaces and brave spaces, psychological safety. And it feeds right into this belonging piece. You know, if people feel that they belong, then, you know, what can happen from there? And in relation to fitting belonging into my blend piece, my blend model, I think it will go nicely under environments, because it's about the environment, you know, that you're in. If you feel as if, you know, but environment, not in the context of building, but just environment in general, if you feel. So that's kind of where I would place that quite nice and neatly.
There you go. I know you did it.
But I liked your story, you know, and I would encourage people to go and look at that, or reach out to G to find out more about the work that's being done around identity. But I really kind of like that. Any thoughts, Gary, from you?
No, thank you for sharing the story, G. From my point of view, I think this belonging piece is really curious because I see it from again, welcome to be challenged on this. But I think, again, this changes an inside job thing. At the end of the day, for sure, for someone that looks like me is going to face less barriers to belong, whatever that means to me in my context. But if we belong to ourselves, can we belong anywhere? Open question. So there's a sort of combination of the two factors for me going on, which is, so coming back to the riots, if people believed that they were enough, regardless how much money they had, food on the table, where they live in the country, if they genuinely felt they were worthy before anything outside of them, would they have gone to the riots? If they belonged to themselves first before anything else outside of them.
It feeds into the self-talk, doesn't it? And it feeds into safety as well.
Well, it does. And in addition to that, again, I don't want to minimize it, but then there is massive complexity, right? So that's a very inside out. Yeah. So yeah, I get that spiritually. That makes sense. And then that E of your blend model is massively influential, probably beyond all the other parts of your model, because it's not down to you all the time, right? That environmental factor is a mixture of your own environment and what's enforced onto you. So my last thing I would want to leave us with is the intersectionality of your model is what's so important. You're not saying, are you, just focus on B, just focus on D. You're saying you need to get all of this running at the same time. Then you get your compassionate environment. And I think that's a big learning, I think, for us still, particularly in the West, is intersectionality, I think.
Absolutely. And, when I've used it, I found that some people will lean into one particular space more than another. Yeah. So, sometimes environment doesn't have to be complex. It could be just pick up your bag and go. Change environment. Sometimes it can be as simple as that. Do you have a handbag, Gary, that you can pick up and go?
Got 4, actually.
Well, there you go. I'm glad to hear that you have a handbag. But the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes these things can be really complex and stuff. But the other side of it as well is this whole UK riots piece. It's all about the intersectionality. There's so many different layers to it. And I think Tom alluded to it in the comments earlier on. So it's not just one dimensional. We've got to think about the whole piece. So, time's pressing on, but I just want to kind of leave those people that have joined us and have been really patient. So thank you for your patience as well over the hour. I just want to leave you with some thoughts from us, the panel, myself, G and Gary, in relation to some of the things that you can think about. Next time, I will be talking more about the compassionate C's, which are conversation, coaching, community, communication, consultation, co-creation, co-production, and connectedness. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that when I'm joined by my other guests. But in the meantime, I'm just going to leave you with a few thoughts. So understanding that, it's more than race. DEIB is more than race, religion, lots of other components. Intersectionality comes into it as well. Any thoughts, G, Gary?
I think the biggest thing for me, which is what this does, is that we need to make space for the conversations as well.
Absolutely.
Don't rush into action without the conversations.
And one of the things I would say as well is that when we're thinking about those conversations, be prepared. Don't go in with an expectation that you're going to come to a conclusion after one short conversation.
Yeah.
You might even get wounded a little bit. So go in with your first aid kit. But be prepared. Shake hands before, shake hands after, because what you're trying to do is reach a mutual, non-judgmental understanding. So any thought on that, Gary, before I move on to the next?
Not at all. I just want to reinforce what G shared. We co-create, as you said, right? We co-create these spaces together. No one is the all-seeing eye. That anyone. And also, what I want to leave us all with, because I've done this recently in my corporate day job. Any one of us can create this space. It needs to be intentional, It needs to be focused on reducing harm for sure. But any one of us can take the lead. So I invite anybody, walk into difference. Don't walk away from it.
Can I add one thing to that, Tony, please?
Sure, go for it.
Right? When you're doing this work, and I thought Gary will back me up on this, no pressure. But when you're doing this work, shame, guilt, defensiveness, anger, aggressiveness, all these things are part of the process.
That's right, yeah.
And I think that once we recognize that, we can recognize that we are going through a process, and not that we see those things as barriers. They're not, they're steps along the way. You will have to feel this discomfort to get to the enlightened place. Don't be afraid of it.
Absolutely.
Mic drop.
So key. And we're going to kind of wrap there. Just a couple of other things I want to throw into the mix. Think about cultural competence and intelligence. Just really see if you can, there's lots out there around that, but feel free to ask any one of us, get in touch and we can see where we can help you. Trauma-informed leadership. So really making sure that you're aware of those 4 R's: realization, recognizing the signs, responding, and resist re-traumatizing. That's a massive piece of that. I've seen that happening so many times. But, what Gary and G have really, built up to is the part 2, which will be coming on the 23rd of September. And we're going to be talking about those safe and brave spaces, psychological safety, what that looks like, how we can create it and how we can help others, whether it's in the schools, whether it's in the community, whether it's in the workplace, or whether it's in our own homes. So on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for everyone that's joined us. Apologies for, the blip with the connections, but thank you for your comments and suggestions as well. And hopefully you can join us on the 23rd. I just want to say thank you to G and Gary. And I just want to leave with a compassionate quote. And that quote is around the fact that the only qualification required to lead with care and compassion is to qualify as being human. And I just want to leave you with that. G, are you human? Gary, are you human? And maybe our listeners need to ask themselves, are they human too? And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for your contributions, Gary and G. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you for spending time with me and my guest today on Critical Reflections with Your Critical Friend. Today, you got just a very, very small sprinkling of Tony's fairy dust. But if you'd like more, then do reach out for speaking or hosting. It's TonyMcClelland.com. For social impact, social justice, or social mobility, check out our work at firstlifegroup.com. I look forward to hearing from you. In the meantime, feel encouraged, be inspired, be empowered, and make a difference. Bye for now.